Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today, I am joined by Ethan Knecht. He is a fellow of the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute and the author of the fantastic Chaufa newsletter. In this episode, we will be reviewing the major trends between China, Taiwan, Latin America, and the Caribbean for the year 2023. We also give some predictions on what you should look out for in thinking about these topics in 2024. So, let's dive in. Hi, Ethan, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Rasheed. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
So, there's a lot to discuss between China, Latin America, and the Caribbean the last year, and it's almost difficult to figure out where to even start. But I want to start with you perhaps giving your view on one of the most important trends we saw last year, and we can essentially go from there.
So, I think the first thing to start off with this year was the changes in investment and financing to the region. Investment and financing, of course, being what China's most known for in the Latin American and Caribbean region. But we've seen a massive change pre and post COVID. Whereas in the 2010s and early 2000s, you saw a lot of investment and financing sponsored by the Chinese government itself, especially from the Chinese policy banks, the Exim Bank and the Chinese Development Bank. This is what the Inter-American Dialogue famously tracks in its reports. This year, we saw, at least from the outset without any firm hard numbers yet, but anecdotally, it seems that the trend of shifting towards commercial banks and commercial companies and lending from those companies or banks, as well as just infrastructure being built in the normal bidding and tender process in the interests and normal investment decision makings of these Chinese companies, becoming more and more important. I think one of the biggest highlights of this was the BRI summit, the Belt and Road Initiative summit at the end of last fall, where China tried to make a big splash. This was the third one. Very few countries notably showed up in this, and in their deliverables, they only had one big, very vague pronouncement, which was a new 350 billion RMB financing window, 48 billion USD, for the China Export-Import Bank and the Chinese Development Bank each. Unclear how big and how long-term these windows are. They also announced an 80 billion RMB window for the Silk Road Fund. But for context, $100 billion is about what the World Bank spends every year. And these deliverables were not on the scale that I think people often think of when they think of Chinese investment and financing in Latin America and the Caribbean in the 2010s. We saw the deliverables for the region they did mention were often things that had happened in the past, like the Guyana East Coast Road Project Phase 1, which was from 2020, or the Phoenix Industrial Park in Trinidad and Tobago, which had been under discussion since at least 2018. I believe it finally opened early 2024, late 2023. It's always a little bit unclear when these things actually get rolled out. But generally, you're seeing a shift away from state-led finance to investments being made by SOEs or private companies or non-policy-oriented banks in the Chinese political economy ecosystem.
I think people often put too much interest in the loan portfolio aspect of Chinese foreign loans. Because as you mentioned, yes, it's clear that the exorbitant or relatively exorbitant numbers decreased substantially last decade, especially post-COVID. But at the same time, it's not the case that there's less lending. So as you mentioned, if there are going to be commercial lenders, so Chinese banks, for example, doing lending, Chinese banks are not independent private actors. They're still state banks in China. So at the money, yes, some of it is definitely a matter of profit motive and so on. But at the end of the day, a lot of the commercial banks in China still reflect a policy agenda from within China. And because of that, they have a more linear approach to funding projects relative to maybe what that project's like core like bare metal profitability forecast is. So that's sure, there's still a lot more loans happening. And then of course, because of COVID and the domestic changes in China, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point in this conversation, there is a recategorization of why certain policy loans are being made. And that's one thing that reverberates across the world now with these seemingly big reduction in kind of state bank loans, where the state-owned enterprises and the commercial banks are now going to be doing a lot more loan, as in many ways people say as it should be. You probably shouldn't have these massive loans to countries that don't really have very good history with repaying massive loans, and that's like a learn from experience type problem. I think this is a trend that will definitely continue. On the other side, people tend to also avoid the reality of perhaps the people that are taking the money, the government shouldn't have been getting that money in the first place. And oftentimes they have very bad project ideas. They're not very economically viable or commercially viable. So all of these things are being reanalyzed and rechecked. And I do think people really push it as some like decline or let's say some inwardness of China, where in reality it's more like a normalization from the world. Most countries did not spend as big money as China did. So China's kind of normalizing how France or the US or the UK does lending. And I think that's just the normal expectation of growth.
I think it's no surprise that some of the most loans that went in that more traditional, what we considered a Chinese traditional lending practice, was to Nicaragua. That was really the big beneficiary of the BRI conference this fall, where they received loans for a airport upgrade and new bridges and a solar plant and new rail lines, or supposedly will, and we'll have a lot of Chinese SOEs coming to do this. But Nicaragua is a more politically sensitive case, of course. Nicaragua really rapidly deteriorating relations with the United States, recent flip from Taiwan. But it makes sense that in a market like Brazil or in Chile or you're moving towards, okay, what's going to make a profit? What's a more normal business decision where we need financing or we're going to be making an investment rather than perhaps would have raised alarm bells 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And just one thing I want to point out, this was, I think, in 2022. There was a new center launched in China called the China Caribbean Development Center. This is late 2022. So you would expect some stuff in 2023 to happen, but absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing happened between that center, and it produced nothing and so on. It has a Twitter page. It still posts tweets, but they have literally zero engagement. And it reminds us of these things. It's always last year have all the announcements, all these handshake events, have these BRI summits, and it's very much smaller regional, sub-regional summits for different governments and so on. And nothing happens. There's always commentary about this event in China, but it's like the event is the destination for things.
Yeah, I think a good example of that was this year there was a Caribbean China consultation held by a PRC Assistant Foreign Minister, Hua Chunying. It was held in Dominica, and they highlight the BRI and the Global Development Initiative and that development center in the speech. And then when you read the Assistant Foreign Minister's comments on what deliverables will be coming out of this and what is China prioritizing in the relationship, 3 of the 4 were just general contacts. One was high-level contacts, inviting more prime ministers and presidents to go back and forth, foreign ministers to go back and forth. Another one was just broadening people-to-people ties, scholarships and cultural events, things like that. And then multilateral cooperation at places like the UN. The only actual tangible deliverable was providing another $1 million to help with disaster prevention, which $1 million for China is barely a tear in their eye. They sneeze $1 million. And so to your point of the announcements are really great, but then in the reality, a lot of that relationship is, okay, we're going to have a conversation. We'll talk. We'll send someone on a fancy trip. And that ends up being the extent of it. The relationship might not be able to bring as much of this policy-oriented, at least financing and investment that people used to believe was the main sort of interaction that was going on.
Yeah, definitely. So this point, though, this financing investment thing is still really the core of how a lot of people and analysts in the US especially always says this is how the US needs to compete with China in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there was a report by CSIS I think it came out either late last year or very early this year. I don't remember.
Yeah, I believe so, late last year.
Where they made some recommendations on how the US can compete with China in the Caribbean and Latin America. And you read it, and it's like, what are we really talking about here? And I want to discuss it a little bit. So they actually quoted a speech from Biden that he gave in 2023 in November, and he mentioned debt trap. This is still a concept that the president of the US in 2023 is talking about, and it's still being quoted around and so on, as if it's some fact of the world, which is any real analyst knows it's nonsensical to even mention that term. But the CSIS, in one of the recommendations, was this idea of you have to increase the flexibility of the DFC to give more loans, essentially development loans in Latin America and the Caribbean, to counter the availability of China's development loans. And I'm like, that's the complete wrong approach. What do you think about that recommendation?
I think there ends up being two issues. And I would like to say at the outset that I personally believe that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, really should have more flexibility and should, on its own merits, provide more loans to the region and have an expanded portfolio. That in its own right is a good thing, providing more money to the region, especially for things like infrastructure. But that said, first of all, I think in just the financing lens, as we've talked about, a lot of the financing is in China moving towards a more commercial angle than this traditionally strategic angle. A good example of this is right now, Honduras is back on its old proposal to build a trans-Pacific dry canal. I think they're advertising it, a train line basically from the Pacific to the Atlantic to compete with the Panama Canal. I think they estimate $20 billion. And President Castro, who recently flipped relations to China and made a big visit there and received a few projects, which were probably politically motivated, pitched this to Chinese investors. And from what I can tell, it's just been pure silence and crickets on this project. Whereas maybe 10 years ago, you think back to the Nicaragua Canal project, which relationships to the Chinese state, of course, was questionable at the time, but still, at least it was a big story in international media. This has pattered off. Whereas you're now seeing the US government, the embassy in Honduras, apparently starting to pitch this project to investors. And the US government is taking a lot of interest in this project, supposedly trying to compete with China. And on the financing side, I guess you have to say, can US government capital compete with Chinese government capital? Probably not. It's just the size of it. You'll never reach a size that it's just going to displace it. And the US can achieve some goal of just displacing Chinese finance from the region. And then we've been saying finance and investment this whole time, but I think it's also just important to recognize that investment as a business decision and business engagement, especially in the infrastructure sector, that gains so much attention from the US media and US policymakers, which is a bit of a different thing and something maybe DFC would facilitate, but isn't something that they do in their own right, of course, is often things that US companies don't want to engage in or don't have the capability to. And while maybe it's in the US interest to be able to build better subway lines and then export better subway line construction around the world, or build better highways and then export highway construction around the world. The fact of the matter is, if you've ever been to the United States, we don't have great subways or high-speed lines.
Exactly.
China it was an export, it wasn't an investment, but exported what's going to be the fastest train in South America to Chile last week. The US is not making these to any extent, right? These high-speed lines are being made in China. And so just on that investment angle, whether it's in the power side.
See, that's the funny thing is, even if DFC were to give the money to one of these countries, who is actually going to build the things?
Exactly. On the investment side, I think probably what's going to be the most notorious example of this is that Ford had a plant in Brazil for decades and decades. It was very famous. And they closed it. It wasn't making money, etc. And I believe it was BYD. I could be wrong, but I believe it was BYD. A Chinese EV company is now building cars at this plant, building autos at this plant. And it's just partially a result of changing market forces. And BYD is one of the largest car companies in the world, one of the largest EV companies in the world. And so these investment trends, maybe there are policy tools that just independently can get the US back up to par to make those types of investments around the world. The fact of the matter is that's not a policy tool. DFC itself is probably not a policy tool to get US companies to make those investments, and is also just not going to be able to likely compete at the financing level, nor as per our previous conversation about the role of policy banks versus more commercial capital, should it.
Yeah, that's the thing. The approach to thinking about international financing, especially from think tank land in the US, is so awkward. Is that the financing has to go to a project, and the project itself needs to be credible. So if you don't have a credible project with essentially people to build a project, manage a project, actually source the materials for the project, you're going to break down. So if you have a project where you're building high-speed rail in Latin America, you're not going to essentially get anything from the US. So even if the US provides the financing, where is the resources going to come from? It's going to come from China.
Right.
And that's just how it is. Or if they provide financing for building like a big dam or something like that, where are the resources going to come from to actually do the construction and so on? The point is not only the money that's literally loaned, it's also the ability to back up the money with resources, both engineering, workers, and so on, to actually do the thing. And the US can't really do that. But I'm not even saying it should. Because one of the amazing things about the US is the US capital market. That is the biggest, deepest in the world. If these projects had credibility, they could be funded by private investors, especially in small countries. Bigger countries, it's a more difficult conversation. But for example, in the Caribbean, there is no lack of financing in the world for Caribbean projects. While there are a lack of projects. So that's the difficult thing. For any project to be done in the Caribbean, it can be completely financed by private markets. Even the deep water harbors, for example, back in the 50s in Barbados were financed by the Barbados government issuing a bond on the international market. That was how it was financed, even back in the 50s. It's all very confused when you think about outcompeting China of policy loans. It's a very muddled, weird conversation.
It is, and especially since you're confused, not you, but the conversation frequently confuses investment and financing and doesn't make a clear goal at the end. I don't think anyone should expect, I don't know if anyone does, but I don't think anyone should expect that China's just going to get up and drop everything and leave the region. They're 25% of the world's economy, a huge portion of the world's population. They're going to be embedded in the region economically for a long time. And like any other country, they're going to have political goals and economic goals. And so if the US wants to compete on that, it's not, yes, maybe some of that will require using the policy tools it has available, like its development bank and its export-import bank. But frankly, the reason why Chinese banks and commercial banks and companies often have a presence in the region is because they're filling a gap that US companies or Western companies are often not taking.
I'm not even sure if I would say it's filling a gap in this sense. I think you're definitely right. You made a very important point of China isn't just going to disappear from the region. That we are well beyond that essentially anymore. China is a massive economy. It's going to be eventually the biggest economy, monetarily speaking, massive population, which will eventually have a much bigger global impact it already has. And almost everything consumed in the region is made in China already. So going back at this point, and then when countries grow, they have to export. The US can only consume so much. Other countries like China will be consuming a lot more in the next few decades. The problem though is that I think people forget that it's not just the China filled a gap. It created new markets. And it's not like a market that was initially, in some of the case, yes, but not a market that was initially held by US investors. There was no market at all. China's companies came in and they created a market. So because of that, it's now also the US in some sense saying, we're going to maintain our own markets and take over the Chinese market and then create even more markets. It's not realistic. And the idea that you can push China out of the region by offering a few $100 million in a one-time loan, it is very childish in that sense.
Yeah, I think ultimately the question is, are these policy tools going to be used just for very targeted? If the US is able to create a strategy in saying these are very targeted areas of concern, for example, telecommunication systems and Huawei, and you target DFC loans at that type of market or DFC financing tools, it has more financing tools than just loans. Okay, I can see a role for that. But if you broaden it out to just China, Mike Gallagher, the head of the CCP committee in the US, has been very outspoken on the China's role in Latin America issue and warns that it's in ruthless pursuit of dominance in the region. If your whole goal is to push out this ruthless pursuit and just kick them out, you're exactly right. The DFC is not going to make a difference in that. Policy tools like that are not going to make a difference. And it's only if you target in specific areas and specifically say these are the US's areas of concern. But ultimately, that's a political question. That's not economically developing the region in any broad term, because that's the role of private business.
Exactly. So let's move on to another trend of last year that is pretty much on everyone's minds, even up to last week, because of the recent diplomatic switch. This is Taiwan and the world. So for those who might not be aware, Taiwan has a substantial proportion of its diplomatic allies in Latin America and the Caribbean. 5 of the 7 are in the Caribbean, properly speaking. Because even the subgroup is even a more high dense number. And this has presented a lot of funny situations where the cross-strait relations is a fairly wide topic in Caribbean politics. This is crazy in many ways. But yes, Ethan, Taiwan and Latin America and the Caribbean.
So, of course, this year started off with a fairly dramatic incident, which was Honduras flipping relations from Beijing to Taipei in March. The timing of it was especially notable because it happened right before President Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen, traveled to Belize and Guatemala for a major trip. This people might be more aware of it because it created a little bit of a diplomatic incident when she traveled to the United States, to New York and California, on either end, bookending the trip. And the Honduras issue got a lot of attention when then Castro signed a bunch of new deals and they started FTA negotiations, and she traveled to Beijing in the summer. But there were a lot of other anti-Taiwan actions on the margin, with Taiwan repealing its free trade agreement with El Salvador, Nicaragua banning Taiwanese organizations in the country and certain NGOs, the Central American Parliament revoking Taiwan's observer status. And to your point of the Caribbean, yes, numerically is very important for Taiwan's remaining formal diplomatic allies, but it also is important substantially in the countries that are actively speaking out for Taiwan still. Whether it's at the United Nations or the World Health Assembly. Now that Taiwan is not in the Central American Parliament, it only has one Central American ally left and one South American ally. The Caribbean is really the place where it's now looking to the region and where you're seeing a lot of the travel by Taiwanese diplomats and Taiwanese leaders. Tsai Ing-wen going there in March. Foreign Minister Wu was in the region as well this past year. And so the region is, we always have this discussion, we can continue on with it, but the diplomatic allies matter in certain ways, but probably not in the ways that people think they do. China is not going to invade when the Caribbean stops recognizing Taiwan if it chooses to. Xi Jinping isn't counting down on his watch the number of diplomatic allies that remain. But with Honduras leaving Taipei, leaving its embassy in Taipei, yes, the Caribbean is now really the center of Taiwan's diplomatic efforts around the world.
Yes, it's one of the funniest conversations because if you have a Taiwan passport, you can travel to the US, travel to Europe, travel to anywhere in the world, really. You think.
Except for Georgia, everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, technically.
And you think that because some rocks in the ocean in the Caribbean stop recognizing you, that will change? Of course not. It has no impact on Taiwan at all. That's the reality of it. It's one of those things where the formal diplomatic allies carry no geopolitical weight at all in reality. The US say, yes, that's a real passport. If Europe says, yes, that's a real passport. If your biggest company powers the world's silicon landscape as a very important to everything in the world, if your economy is as big as Australia, nothing the Caribbean would do or say helps you. This is the thing. They always use some press conference, say, oh, the Prime Minister of St. Kitts gave a speech at the UN saying the Taiwan should have more say in world health policy. Look at this. So what? So what? And also, oh, the Caribbean is supporting democratic allegiances in Taiwan, therefore it's amazing. Look at that, China. Take that, China. So what? One of Taiwan's allies in the Caribbean, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, has had a prime minister for more than 20 years. The same prime minister. He's a big fan of Maduro, actually. He has an autobiography called The Comrade. He perpetually makes the opposition in St. Vincent untenable. But we call him a super democratic ally simply because his government supports Taiwan. It's all these kind of weird things. So like, when you look at the facts of the world, this whole Caribbean, Taiwan diplomatic ally discussion really is gone to a weird fantasy land in a real way. And I think you mentioned in one of the Chaufa newsletters, there was a political candidate in Taiwan who mentioned that even if Taiwan loses all diplomatic allies, so what? Taiwan's still Taiwan. I think that's true. That's clearly true. So yeah, it's definitely a very hot topic. It always comes up, especially from US analysts when they talk about the Caribbean, China, Taiwan triangle. But it's such a non-topic. Even the countries that are former Taiwan allies, everything they consume is made in China. Right? All the stoves, the microwaves, the bicycles, it's all made in China. They're still getting all the benefit of Chinese economics, but still support Taiwan. Eventually, just from that fact alone, you should realize it's eventually going to change by bearing very boring economic reasons. By no fault of Taiwan or no prize of China, eventually they will all switch to PRC.
Yeah, I would add, it's interesting. So I live, for listeners who might not know, I live in Taiwan. I've lived here for about a year and a half now. And I've heard two political reasons that are minor, but I think interesting to why the Caribbean in particular matters. One is, aside from speaking up at the UN, there's a lot of backroom activity where these allies, especially the Caribbean allies, will let Taiwan better understand what is happening internally at these types of organizations. So when ICAO makes a decision, or the WHO makes a decision, or another UN organ makes a decision, provides Taiwan a little bit more insight than perhaps the US mission would in New York. And then the other reason that's often cited in Taiwanese media, or at least English-speaking Taiwanese media, is that it provides an excuse for someone like Tsai Ing-wen to go to the United States to do a quote-unquote transit stop, right? Because when Tsai went to New York, or when William Lai, the vice president and now president-elect, traveled to Paraguay for the presidential inauguration this summer, they're saying, oh, we're flying to Paraguay, but it's far away. We're flying to St. Vincent, or we're flying to Belize. We need to take a layover, and they go visit important people in the United States. And so without that, those two issues might become a little bit more difficult if Taiwan were to lose these Caribbean allies. But the thing is that ultimately, especially when it comes to speaking up in these organizations, the G7 puts out a statement saying, we support Taiwan. And they don't say we support Taiwan per se, but they effectively say we support peace on the Taiwan Strait, and Taiwan should be able to engage in these international bodies, at least as an observer. And I'm sure they can find a new excuse to have the president of Taiwan stop over
Exactly.
United States that is not visiting Belize. But these are legitimate political reasons. They're just not the very existence of the Taiwanese state. And I think another important point that often gets missed in these conversations is that none of these countries recognize a country called Taiwan. They recognize a country called the Republic of China. And when you do polling on, to Ko Wen-je's point, the presidential candidate who said at one point, these countries, these diplomatic allies don't matter, and then was forced to retract that statement, part of the reason is this concept of the Republic of China is very contested on Taiwan. Not to get too much into Taiwanese politics, but there are some people who view, just the continued existence of the ROC as not really all that important. But then there's also people who view it as actually a bad thing, and that if Taiwan were to lose all of its diplomatic allies, it would actually be good, because then no country would recognize the Republic of China, and all that would be left would be a country called Taiwan. This is not necessarily a mainstream point of view, but it is a point of view that does exist on the island. And so regardless of what view someone takes, I think I saw some polling recently, and it put people who care about Taiwanese who care about the formal diplomatic allies under 50%. I think it was under a third percent, if I remember, under a third. And so frankly, even just on the island, aside from these very specific, narrow diplomatic issues that matter maybe to the foreign ministry, it really just does not matter to the populace at large.
That's the same in the Caribbean. For example, a friend of mine who was a member of his State Department, he gave a story where they were in a particular country, which is in the Caribbean, there's a Taiwan ally, and they were at an award ceremony for some project that was funded by Taiwan. And the minister of the government of that country very boldly said, we thank our friends for the People's Republic of China for giving us this loan. So even the government, they don't really understand the difference either. They think Taiwan is the same thing as PRC, ROC, same as PRC. No one knows the difference. And people also, for example, there was a independent review of the Foreign Affairs Commission in St. Lucia. These are essentially academics that were taken on by a committee to review the foreign policy of the country. And they also said, why are we recognizing Taiwan? This doesn't make any sense for St. Lucia. These people are, for example, very ideologically driven. I know the names of them. Some are, to be fair. But even like the academic class in the countries don't really get why this is a real thing. Unless these come down to very important features. It's not the population in the Caribbean that cares. It's not the academic. It's not the policy. It's the particular administration at the particular time that cares about this issue. And that's a very weak thing to stand on. And we saw in St. Lucia even, they actually switched back and forth between PRC and Taiwan, I think 3 times since the 1980s. So it's also very fragile for the populace on the Caribbean side too. And That is a weird place to put yourself in. And that's why it is always a conversation about these things are really not discussed in a very realistic way. For example, be surprised if in 5 years Taiwan has any allies in the Caribbean. I think I will be surprised by that reality. But again, just through literally no fault of Taiwan, it's just very boring opportunity cost reasons why the current Taiwan Caribbean allies will switch to PRC.
And then additionally, on the Taiwanese side, they often have the opportunity to maintain these relationships when they're about to switch and choose not to. When Honduras flipped relations this past year, the foreign ministry at least said that they had asked Taiwan for billions of dollars in aid, maybe $2.5 billion in aid to build a hospital and a dam. And the Taiwanese government said no. And Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen had this great quote where she says, "We don't engage in meaningless contest of dollar diplomacy with China."
Yeah, I think that's quite fair.
Because exactly to that point, that's viewed as a waste of taxpayer dollars here. This past week, one of Taiwan's Pacific allies dropped relations with Taiwan. And they were asking for, I could be getting this number wrong, but I believe it was in like $80 million, $100 billion for an immigration facility. $80 billion.
It's Nauru, correct?
Yeah, Nauru, yeah. $80 million to the 22nd largest economy in the world. Again, it's a sneeze. If they really valued having 12 diplomatic allies instead of 11, they would have put up $80 million. But the foreign ministries, they claim they did not have a chance to respond. But even if they had, they probably would not have provided it because there are value to certain diplomatic partners, and there are very specific reasons why those partners can matter. But writ large, not having them, Taiwan is not about to fall into the sea and its security widely imperiled just because St. Vincent no longer recognizes Taiwan, right? Or it doesn't even recognize the Republic of China.
Yeah, it should definitely not play these extortion games. If a country is trying to extort Taiwan, they should say, no, it's really as simple as that. And then, 'cause that's a very dangerous game to start. It opened with 18 million, trying to say, hey, give 200 million. The numbers games are not worth it. So Taiwan's completely correct to really hold ground on that point. That's how it should be.
There is another interesting trend that I don't think gets discussed a lot around Taiwan in the region, but is equally important, if not becoming more important, which is those non-official partners in the region. Right now, Taiwan has, I believe, in 6 countries, Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, 7 countries, has representation offices and maintains some level of diplomatic partnership with these countries. They invest in these countries. They engage in APEC with these countries. And this is the DPP, the ruling party in Taiwan, is increasingly focusing on these type of relations. And yet what we haven't seen in Latin America is generally these Latin American governments and Caribbean governments that don't recognize Taiwan as well, engaging more publicly in these fora. So most recently when Lai Ching-te won the election, you saw partners in Europe and Asia and Canada and the United States send congratulations to the government. Whereas, as far as I can tell publicly, no head of state in Latin America or the Caribbean that does not recognize Taiwan sent a similar congratulations. And you do see when these one China policy issues come up over and over again, such as most recently when in Argentina, a member of President Milei's, the new president's cabinet, met with the de facto ambassador from Taiwan. The Chinese flipped out and caused a great big diplomatic incident and forced a meeting between the ambassador and the foreign minister, where the foreign minister had to effectively publicly apologize and reaffirm commitment to the One China principle and Argentina's One China policy. And so as we see these formal diplomatic partners become less and less important, I actually think into 2024 and beyond, you're going to see these unofficial relationships become more important. And the question is, does Latin America and the Caribbean continue this path of not speaking up or investing in that relationship? And do the Taiwanese see an opportunity or not in establishing new tech rows and new representation offices across the region? Or is that just not something Taiwan's focused on, and Taiwan ends up focusing away from the Western Hemisphere, aside from Canada and the United States?
I would imagine Taiwan would do more of these unofficial institutions in key Latin American countries for commercial reasons. There are good commercial reasons why you should have call it informal political or foreign political operation domestically. In the Caribbean, there's no market for Taiwanese goods, any realistic market. So I would suspect that will not advance in any real way. Plus, I would probably think maybe 1 or 2 Caribbean countries might even leave this year to the allyship with Taiwan. So you actually brought up the Milei administration and Argentina, which I think is a relevant thing to discuss because that has been in various news cycles with regard to China, Latin America quite substantially because Argentina was I won't say a poster child, but Argentina was frequently associated with the PBOC currency swap arrangements because they were the recipient of call it for simple terms, loans from China in Chinese yuan. And that was a very often used example of China's growing internationalization of its domestic currency via Argentina, Pakistan, and so on. But now, of course, with the new administration, Milei administration, his entire plan is to dollarize Argentina, which I think should go forward with quite quickly. And if that happens, of course, there is no need for any more RMB swaps in Argentina. I should add, though, it's a very important point. When Argentina received the RMB from China, and the idea is this, just to give the background to what a swap is. Essentially, Argentina would give PBOC, the Chinese Central Bank, a allotment of Argentinian pesos, and PBOC would give Argentina an allotment of Chinese yuan, and that's essentially to facilitate trade. However, what happens in fact is when Argentina gets the allotment or the contract for the Chinese renminbi, they would swap the renminbi for US and then use the USD for its own purposes. While people always say, look, the expansion of our renminbi is very clear in Argentina, they're becoming closer with China and this, but in reality, they're just taking the RMB, change it into USD, and then using the USD. Now, if Milei's plan does go forward quickly, Argentina will dollarize, therefore it has no shortage then of USD for any kind of purposes, and the swap just disappears essentially with PBOC. And that entire example that analysts in DC always use for RMB internationalization just goes away overnight because in reality it never had any ground in the first place. So that's why I think this Milei, Argentina, China situation kind of relevant because it really kind of brings, facts to light, and it can't really hide behind these bad analyses anymore.
Right. I think the Argentina example has been especially interesting in just how much political leadership can change the dynamic. That when we say, oh, the Argentina-China relationship, the Brazil-China relationship, etc., it isn't some black box country, but who is in power actually matters. And so I think you were right in saying that Argentina, in a lot of ways, was the poster child of Latin America, Caribbean, China relations, where there was lots of investment. Earlier this year, there had been a $1.7 billion investment in Argentina's lithium production sector by a Chinese firm, Tsingshan. And on the political side, Argentina was poised to join BRICS. The president of Argentina had visited China twice in 2 years, 2022 and then in 2023, which perhaps another country, maybe Russia or someone like that, had done, but that was very unusual, especially for the region. Another level of financing infrastructure when Fernandez went to visit in 2022, they reiterated all these projects, so a lot of them that had started under the Kirchner administration, but were these big, massive, what we traditionally consider these China investments and financing in the region with these big dams and a nuclear power plant and so forth. And now it looks like a lot of that's going to stop or is turned off. Argentina pulled out of doing BRICS. It's unclear, I think, if Milei will visit China. I think is probably pretty unlikely, at least in the near term. And I think it's completely off the table that she will visit Argentina anytime soon. Investments are likely to continue, but I think for a different reason, which we could discuss more. And financing infrastructure, they claim that they paused the swap. And I do wonder if these Chinese finance projects and the infrastructure projects that were more symbolic than anything else get put on the chopping block or at least get paused until a new administration. There was also, Argentina was one of the few countries that really had a security angle, where of course is that questionable, likely Chinese military installation in Patagonia in southern Argentina that's associated on the surface with China's space program, but of course that's very closely tied to the PLA. And so now there's a lot of questions being raised of will Milei end to that arrangement or change that arrangement? And so I think that the swap part is important, but even beyond that, of just showing how much the relationship can just change in a month.
Yes, that's true. That's true. It's been a month. It's a very good point. Yes. I think Belay will definitely cut down on a lot of the Chinese projects that are somewhat explicitly security related or even 50% security related, primarily because of his own ideological commitments. His brand, his entire brand is anti-communist and anti-authoritarian and anti-socialist. So because of that, he can't be seen as being in cahoots with the socialists or the communists. Now, on the other side, the commercial aspect of Argentina and China will definitely continue. There's China needs lithium, Argentina needs to sell lithium. That's how the market works. And various other projects that have very commercial activity, banking, for example, will definitely continue and so on. People tend to not realize it's always a mixed bag.
I think to your point, too, about with the swaps and the political side of it and how a lot of it's just a show and so forth, is I think you're right, especially on the financing and investment end and the trade end of the things that really matter in that relationship will continue, like lithium extraction. Partly that's, I'm not an Argentina expert, but my understanding of the role of the governors and the states and the local distribution of power is a lot higher in Argentina, of course, than a lot of other countries. And even in the past month, we've seen a lot of engagement at the local level still with the Chinese. It's not just at the national level. And that's been happening for years and years. And that will continue to happen and move the relationship forward. But just this past week, the Minister of Mining, the new Minister of Mining, met with, I believe it was the Chinese ambassador or some senior Chinese official to keep that economic relationship moving. And yes, those political angles will probably dissipate a bit because of Malay's priorities and his ideological commitments. Just as we've been saying earlier, that China's an unavoidable part of the global marketplace. China is going to be an unavoidable part of the Argentine economy. It's just going to be diverging from those political parts that were politically motivated that might get swept under the rug a bit, whereas those key economic ones will continue.
Yeah, I think anyone should admit that's a good thing. There is no real benefit of being too locked in step with the essentially communist politics. That's not what any democratic country should be wanting to do. That's fair. But again, the commercial aspects, you can't really ignore that at all. It has to play the game correctly. Ethan, we're coming to the end of the conversation of almost an hour, and I want to give some idea of what are we looking out for most in 2024 when it comes to China, Latin America, the Caribbean, Taiwan, politics, and economics. So maybe you could start here.
Yeah. So one thing, I think this doesn't necessarily get a lot of attention, and it's very symbolic, but when she visits the region, she has not visited the region since before COVID. So it's now been, almost 5 years. He is almost certainly going to. It seems that he'll be visiting Peru for the G20, and maybe he'll stop over in, Brazil for the G20, possibly Peru for APEC. But there's a question is, does he stop over in the Caribbean? Does he stop over in Mexico? Does he stop over in Chile on the way? And if so, does he announce any deliverables? Since a lot of times when you have these really important visits, is a new fund or center or something established in this process? And as we talked about, that doesn't necessarily radically change the relationship, and it's most likely not to. But I think that will be a major news story if it does happen. And then the other half of this, to what we talked about, is I think the U.S. will continue to step up certain policy actions, politically motivated policy actions, because it says it's in competition with China, especially if Donald Trump wins the election in November.
So it does seem that the last time a U.S. president visited the Caribbean was that's when Obama went to Cuba. But excluding Cuba, Obama went to Jamaica in 2015. I believe there was some summit happening there. 2015 was the last time a sitting U.S. president went to the Caribbean proper, plus Cuba. And yet there's so much conversation about how to further engage the Caribbean in U.S. politics, and the presidents don't even go. And it's so close. You can get from D.C. to Jamaica in 3 hours. Kind of funny.
Yeah, I believe Biden was vacationing in the Caribbean, but he doesn't make
was he?
show of it. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure he was just in the Caribbean for vacation. So.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So my trend I'm looking out for is regarding to a lot of more commercial lending by Chinese banks. These are commercial banks. For example, there are 2 commercial banks of China in Panama. Bank of China in Panama and ICI I think it's ICICI. They opened in Panama in 2022 or 2021, so very recently. I wonder if you're going to see more Chinese branch expansions in Latin America and perhaps even the Caribbean. Because obviously offshore in the Caribbean, there's a fair amount of Chinese commercial activity financial-wise. So I personally am looking at that trend a bit more in 2024. And then in terms of politics, I do expect the US, of course, to be trying to create even more initiatives to deal with outcompeting China in the region. But I think like every other one, it will just be on paper, which is like a similarity between US and China. They always have these regional initiatives and programs, but they don't actually exist in the real world. So I remember, what was it called? I forget what it's called now. Was it Grow America? That was a Trump policy. And then you had, was it SALPI, like Small and Less Populous Islands program? That was early Biden. And then you had another one that was started recently called American Economic Partnership.
The Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Yeah.
There you go. So all these things are coming up and they don't materialize into anything. So I suspect we're going to get a new acronym this year, and that will have a whole bunch of analysts in DC talking about how it's the best thing since sliced bread, and I expect to see those probably by summer.
Yeah. I would also add to that. So in this Ukraine supplemental that's being negotiated in Congress, part of it's countering China. And in general, you're seeing across Congress a lot of focus on putting forward bills that institutionally change the U.S. government or put more money into countering China, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And so I think in addition to these acronyms, like you're saying, where APEP, no one really is sure what it is, and I don't think we're ever going to really know what it is, you will see some possible bureaucratic changes in Washington or new money that's supposedly programmed to combat China, but ultimately is probably just at the margin benefiting the region, and we're using the excuse of competing with China to give that money. Now, whether providing that money as development assistance is worth it is probably a different question, but per our earlier conversation, is that going to push China out of the region?
Exactly, no. Ethan, thank you so much for coming on the show today for discussing the important trends of China, Latin America, Caribbean, Taiwan, US policy. We gotta find a shorthand to say that at some point.
Yeah.
For all listeners, do subscribe to Chaufa at cpsi.media. Ethan produces a really good newsletter about all these topics, and I think we should do another one of these podcasts quite soon.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this episode. For updates about the podcast, please subscribe to our Substack blog found on cpsi.media. You can also read our newsletters and long-form content on Caribbean policy improvements.